welcome back. So today we're looking at chapter 3.3. This is a little bit of an information heavy subject, so just, get comfortable. Okay, so 3.3a kind of talks about economic and military reasons for appeasement. So let's look at economical reasons first. So the public in both Britain and France absolutely did not want another war. The first one had the first one had been devastating, and people could see that any more war would be even worse, especially after bombing becoming a thing, aerial bombing. They'd already seen what happened to civilians in Madrid and Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. On top of that, both countries were still suffering badly from the Great Depression. They simply couldn't afford to prepare for war financially. And both relied heavily on international trades. Getting getting into a conflict would disrupt that massively. This is a big reason why they didn't properly sanction Japan. In the last chapter, we talked about that. Britain had strong trading links with Japan and didn't want to lose them. There were also the worry that Japan might attack British territories like Hong Kong and Singapore if Britain pushed too hard. So protecting their own economy and um, government or empire came first. They the same logic applied to Germany. Taking military action to push Germany out of the Rhineland or responding to the Anschluss would mean an expensive war in Central Europe. Germany was technically just moving into its own territory, so it's kind of like for what? Next is military reasons. Neither Britain nor France was in a good military position. France had built the Maginot Line, which was a huge line of defense, fortifications along its border with Germany, which shows their whole strategy was about defending themselves and not going against, causing the war. Britain had spent years cutting down defense spending under the 10-year rule, which assumed Britain wouldn't need to fight a major war for at least a decade because they were trying to cut down, especially due to the Depression. Um, by the time they ditched that rule in 1932, the Great Depression meant they couldn't afford to build their forces back up quickly. The British military was already stretched thin, just defending its empire. Getting involved in a war in China, Africa, Spain, or Central Europe was just like they couldn't do that. Um, and there because of the anti-Comintern pact between Germany, Japan, and Italy, any military action against Germany would drag Britain and France into conflict with Japan in the Far East at the same time. Okay, now let's talk about relations with the USSR, which is 3.3b. Um, so another big factor in why appeasement happened was how Britain and France felt about the Soviet Union, and it made things more complicated. During the 1930s, many British and French politicians were actually more scared of communism spreading than they were of Hitler. They saw Hitler's Germany as a useful barrier, stopping Soviet communism from spreading westward. Some even quietly thought that a strong Germany keeping Russia in check wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Britain and France had never really trusted the USSR. They didn't like its communist ideology. They were suspicious of its pro communist propaganda being spread. And France was worried the USSR had ambitions to take back territory in Europe, east of Europe. But in 1934, Germany and Japan had turned into an aggressive military dictatorship, which worried the USSR a lot. Stalin knew Hitler had his eyes on Eastern Europe and Russia, so the USSR started trying to build better relations with Britain and France out of mutual fear of Germany. In 1935, France and the USSR signed a treaty of mutual assistance, basically agreeing to back each other up if either was attacked. The USSR also signed an alliance with Czechoslovakia that same year, and in September 1935, the USSR joined the League of Nations, becoming a permanent member. Um, but the improvement in relations was never based on trust. Britain still refused to sign a formal alliance with the USSR, and they saw it as unreliable or undemocratic. The USSR helping the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War made Britain and France even more suspicious because they saw it as the Soviets trying to spread communism through the back door. When Germany and Japan formed the Anti-Comintern Pact, Stalin felt threatened and pushed harder to get proper military alliance with Britain and France. But like I said, Britain wouldn't commit. Feeling isolated and vulnerable, Stalin eventually made the shocking decision to sign an alliance with Germany instead, which was called the Nazi-Soviet Pact. So we'll get into that a little bit later. Um, 3.3c, which talks about kind of like appeasing Hitler directly. By 1938, Hitler had been in power 5 years and had already completely disregarded the Treaty of Versailles. Germany had rearmed, taken the Rhineland, and taken over Austria, and at every step, nobody had stopped him. A lot of British politicians genuinely believed the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh on Germany. They thought Hitler was just fixing legitimate wrongs, and that once those grievances were sorted, he'd settle down. Hitler had also worked hard to look reasonable to the public. He signed a non-aggression pact with Poland in 1934, claiming he wanted peace. However, we know this will not be true. Hitler had also deliberately driven a wedge between Britain and France. At the disarmament conference, he made France look like the unreasonable one. Then in 1935, he signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement directly with Britain, allowing Germany to build up its navy way beyond the Treaty of Versailles limits. France was furious. Britain had gone behind their back and accepted German rearmament without consulting them. This fed this sorry this created like a growing distrust between Britain and France and the two allies. The pattern of this kept repeating because Hitler eventually knew he wouldn't have anybody to stop him. France was scared of Germany but wouldn't act without British backing them. And Britain kept either um like kind of saying no or making like on the side deals with Germany, and Hitler kept noticing that neither would actually do something serious about everything that they're doing. So now let's talk about the Rhineland. In March 1936, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone on Germany's western border that had been specifically set up after World War I to protect France. This was a direct example of not obeying Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno treaties. Hitler later admitted it was a massive gamble. His army wasn't strong enough to resist if France pushed back, but he read the situation right. France didn't act. They were in a financial crisis. Overestimated, and sorry guys, they overestimated how many German troops were there, and as always needed Britain's support before doing anything. Britain didn't do anything either. Most people felt German troops moving into German territory wasn't really their problem. One politician called it Germans walking into their own backyard because of how bad it was. I just thought I had to point that out. It's not something you need to know for your test, but I just thought it was kind of like an exaggeration that showed how bad the situation was. So yeah, let's look at 3.3D, which talks about the Anschluss and the Munich crisis. In March 1938, Germany took over Austria, the Anschluss, which means union. The Treaty of Versailles had banned this, so it was another violation. By now, Chamberlain was British Prime Minister and was totally committed to appeasement. He believed talking to Hitler, not confronting him, was the best way to keep peace. Not everyone agreed. Churchill and Anthony Eden, uh, who were the resigned foreign secretary, both thought this approach was dangerous and naive, but Chamberlain had most of the British public on his side, and people didn't want a war. Austria was far away. Most of Austrians actually seemed to want the Union, and it didn't feel like Britain's fight. So Britain and France issued strong condemnation. Oh my gosh, sorry, condemnations and did nothing else. So now let's talk about the Munich crisis. This is where appeasement reaches like its final straws. Hitler's next target was Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. He claimed these people were being mistreated and Germany needed to step in. He started by asking for areas where over half the population was ethnically German, then pushed his demands to the entire Sudetenland region. The Sudetenland contained over 70% of Czechoslovakia's heavy industry and its main defensive fortifications, and giving this up would leave the country defenseless. This Czech's government refused, and the war looked pretty likely. Britain and France were technically obligated to protect Czechoslovakia, but they again did not want a war. And so Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times to negotiate properly with Hitler. The result was the Munich conference oh my gosh, in September 1938. Um, this deal handed the entire Sudetenland to Germany. In return, Hitler promised he had no more territorial demands, and Czechoslovakia was told to accept it or fight Germany completely alone. Chamberlain flew home, declaring it meant peace for our time, and most people in Britain and France were hugely relieved. Um, but Churchill called it a total and unmitigated defeat and said Hitler couldn't be trusted. Other people privately agreed with this. However, nobody really did anything. Again. And the Munich Agreement also damaged relations with the USSR badly. Stalin hadn't been invited despite having an alliance with Czechoslovakia. From his perspective, Britain and France con- had just handed Hitler a weakened Czechoslovakia, which is a country that had been formed a buffer between Germany and the USSR. And Stalin concluded that Britain and France would never seriously stand up to Hitler and probably wouldn't protect USSR either. This changed their thinking completely and pushed him toward the eventual deal with Germany, where you'll see later that they take over Poland. Yeah, so this Munich agreement is kind of like the final straw before chaos, which we will talk about later. So I will see you then. Goodbye.